one of the challenges that I sometimes see is when voices are asked for input and then the feedback is not acknowledged or not included or not followed up with. Somebody's like, well, great. I don't see any of my input anywhere in any of this. Why'd you ask me? Well, hello and welcome. Let's dive in and welcome to the Leadership Growth Hour, an interactive monthly event that features timely leadership topics and tools to grow your leadership performance. I'm your host, Daniel Stewart, executive consultant and coach and president of Stewart Leadership, a global consulting, coaching, and training firm aligning organizations on leadership, teaming change, and talent. In short, we develop the people side to enable your growth strategies. Today, I'm excited to be joined by strategy planning expert and executive consultant, Nolan Godfrey. Welcome, Nolan.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be with you and with everyone.
And I believe this is your second time on Leadership Growth Hour. Is that correct?
It is. I had the pleasure in the spring and also enjoyed that opportunity.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, folks. So now on to today's topic area, making strategic planning work across the organization. Okay, Nolan, let's start off with a potentially controversial question. Is strategic planning really worth it? What do you think? Is it something that organizations should even do? How do you respond to that as we're kicking off this here?
Well, Daniel, it's a great question, and there's probably as many answers to it as there are people that have joined us today. My first response would be a little fun, a little flippant, maybe. Is it important for us as humans to have a brain to operate and to, help us figure out what we're doing and why? And in some respects, I view strategy in that way for an organization and a business. It really is, call it the central processor, the place where, all of your choices ultimately lead back to strategy. And so if you have clarified a strategy and if you have aligned your business around that strategy, then it's incredibly valuable because it will produce those two outcomes, clarity and alignment. And if you don't, then the choice that you're making is to allow the focus, the attention, the resources of your business to be haphazardly applied and run, and with no guaranteed outcomes. So I would say it's incredibly important and vital, regardless of how in-depth or how intricate a process someone runs.
Sure. So you're saying it's up there with breathing. It's up there with the essential elements. Now,
absolutely.
It sounds like, though, the different shapes and sizes can vary tremendously across an organization, depending upon what's needed. But the point is to have some level of planning in a consistent way, a proactive way.
That is correct. Because as a business leader, as a business owner, you ultimately want to influence your fate and your results as much as possible. And strategy really is a starting point from which to do that.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate. I was talking with a business leader a little while back, and he said, I do not believe in strategic planning at all. It's not worth it. It is a waste of time. I tell my people what they need to do every day, and that's all that's needed. Just keep them focused on day-to-day tasks. As you're hearing this, Nolan, what are the reactions that you have inside of you? What are the reactions?
Yeah. So I have several reactions. One, that is certainly a choice, right? That's certainly a way to run a business. One of our clients said to me once, they were talking about an individual, and they named the person, and they said, this individual doesn't scale. And their point was that, unless they build more capacity and more capability, they're going to be stuck contributing at the level they're contributing at and getting the results that they've been getting. And so this leader, once they hit their capacity to direct and demand task fulfillment, that will be the extent to which their strategy can deliver results. And the other piece of this, from an employee experience and engagement perspective, those employees are likely going to feel like they are cogs in a wheel, like they're robots, they're machines, and they have no say or creativity in how they're contributing, in bringing their own best skills and talents to work. And so it is a capability stifling approach, especially if you are in even a smaller organization or trying to grow in any degree.
It's interesting you mentioned this. So think of a client experience that maybe they haven't focused on a strategic planning effort. They haven't had a united ability to be able to have a focus around a common direction. What has happened because of the lack of that? And then in contrast, as they then adopted a specific approach and were galvanized and created a cohesive plan, what then changed after that?
Yeah, I actually, we could talk for a long time about these experiences, Daniel. I've had a lot of those experiences, and there are some interesting common threads. I think the first is, it's what we've already mentioned. There's a level of clarity and alignment that comes from this process. Again, regardless of the shape or the size or the complexity of it, the act of getting a team, whatever team that is, together to put together a strategy and to discuss the choices that you're making and leading the organization creates this clarity and this alignment. And now, it's not always pretty and it's not always perfect, right? And it can take time to do that. But every organization that I have seen, that I have been able to work with, has moved towards those two outcomes. The other benefit that sometimes we don't think about is the team effectiveness aspect. So sometimes people have in their heads, hey, we want to go do team building. And what sometimes the shape that takes is, hey, let's go get some chili cheese dogs and go bowling together, right? That's great. Or whatever your favorite activity is. That's fine. That helps you get to know one another. But when you are working on a strategy, when you are working on laying out a roadmap for the organization, the degree of team behaviors that requires, right? Raising conflicts, managing them appropriately, listening respectfully to one another, understanding different points of view from different functional areas or different business units. There are so many residual benefits to the team. And there's a great example that I had of this with a client recently, where it was a bit serendipitous, but they ended up going and doing an escape room as a team after their first day of strategic planning. And the escape room became a team lab that ultimately, the second day of their planning session, showed up and fostered some conversation from the prior day, from the work they had been doing and from how they had been feeling about that as a team. And it really brought the strategy and the team together and into a cohesive unit. So there are so many benefits that come from this, that organizations that aren't doing it, or teams that are not, are experiencing. The downsides for sure.
Yeah. And you raised a great point in terms of this team development benefit. And sometimes clients will approach and say, hey, we need to create a strategic plan. And so let's create that plan. Others are like, we needed to build a team. And actually, we find out we need to build a strategic plan, and that actually helps facilitate the team development. So it's an interesting way of combining the two, because the planning process is just the first half. It's also then the ongoing implementation, which then requires the team cohesiveness to then continue it and to execute it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I saw another recent example with a client where this particular team had been together, if you can believe it, this particular team had been together for 2 years in a fairly large organization, and had not met together to talk about their strategy. And so the lack of trust, the lack of decision-making effectiveness, the silos, there were all kinds of negative aspects to this. And in a relatively short amount of time doing strategy planning, all of those things have started making progress, right? Silos are coming down, different team members are understanding one another better, and there's more clarity and action that is focused and directed towards this particular business's strategy. So there really are so many benefits to doing this.
Yeah. As you think of strategic planning, the process, the approach, what does good look like? What does a good strategic planning process approach actually look like in your mind, Nolan?
Yeah. So I think there are some common elements, and what I want to say up front is I don't think there's one size that fits all. So if you're thinking about processes or frameworks or time frames, those all have to be in the context of the business, and the cadence and the culture and the team. But several common elements. Number one, the decision-making rights need to be clear. So everyone needs to understand who gets to make decisions. Is it truly a consensus? Is it democratic? Is there someone that ultimately puts the stamp of approval on the strategy and how it gets outlined? So I think that's important. I also think having a structure to how you're doing your strategy planning is critical. Again, the details of it, there are lots of different methods, but having a structure that everyone is clear about is really important. And you also need to make sure that your deliverables, your outcomes from the process are clear. So what is it that we ultimately want to walk away with? Is it strategic pillars and objectives that cascade into goals? Is there a vision or mission component to this? What exactly are those deliverables and the collateral that you expect to come out of this, even though you don't have it developed at the beginning? And then, I would say you want it to be collaborative enough where you have the right inputs from different individuals, different leaders that have a perspective on the business, right? That have a particular angle. So a classic approach, again, not the only approach, would be that a senior executive team with representation from each functional area, from each business unit, would get together, at least at a business level, to be able to represent. Because the more diversity of thinking and of experience and of organizational need you can get, the better. The more complete picture you're going to see as you get into this process. So those are a few of the key elements or key success factors that I see common across all of the strategy work that I've seen and that I've helped facilitate and lead.
Yeah, and building on the title of our conversation here, making it work across the organization, let's pull on this idea of how do you make that happen? Who do you involve? So as I've done a fair amount of this as well, I see a couple different iterations, a couple different versions, and I'd like your reactions to this. So one version is it's kind of done in the smoke-filled room. One or two or a handful of people go off by themselves, and I'm going to exaggerate a little, but it's not that much of an exaggeration, done in a vacuum in some sort. They decide, and then they come forth and say, this is the direction, and the rest of the people just kind of say, aye, aye, and they follow it. Now, it's neither right nor wrong, it's just one approach.
Yeah.
Another approach is an active involvement of getting input from several different sources, inside and out of the organization, different levels, getting feedback throughout. That can take a lot more time, provide more buy-in. Back and forth, there are pros and cons to this, and of course, variations. What are your reactions as you're hearing this? What are different ways of making this process work across the organization itself?
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. There are different approaches. And again, there's not one size that fits all. For me, one of the keys is that if a senior leader, let's say, wants to declare the strategy for the organization, I think that can be an acceptable approach. I think that can be doable. There could be situations where that's very valuable. Think of the degree of clarity that will provide. In order to make that work across the entire organization, what becomes really important is that senior leader is crystal clear about what is not negotiable, what are the ultimate directions and outcomes that are expected of everyone. And then from there, where are the places where people can be creative, they can be empowered, they can come up with their own goals and plans and approaches to execute on that strategy. And so in a situation like that, I think you can make it work. Now, the one downside is, we know that people are more committed to something they help create, right? And so you do miss that benefit. So the idea of, at any level in the organization, as you are cascading, as you're communicating, the idea of people being able to get clear about what really matters for the company, and then two, for them to be empowered to be able to contribute at their highest level to bringing that about, that's where I've seen that you get the most engagement, the most excitement, and the most alignment into the organization. So it's variable about how many individuals, how many teams can and should be involved in a process. Think of a really large organization. You could never have hundreds of thousands of people involved in a meaningful way in order to create that, right? But getting data points and getting input from employees, from your surveys that you do, from whatever data gathering you have inside, outside with customers, outside with shareholders or other key stakeholders, those inputs are extremely valuable. And you can do that without having all those people in a room with you.
So utilizing lots of different mechanisms, and what I'm hearing is it's the choices up front to be able to then be clear about what's negotiable, what's not, what needs to happen, and why we want to involve other voices. One of the challenges that I sometimes see is when voices are asked for input, and then the feedback is not acknowledged or not included or not followed up with. And that is one of the challenges. Then somebody's like, well, great, I don't see any of my input anywhere in any of this. Why'd you ask me?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a nuance, and it takes some extra work, but it could be as simple as a conversation that says, hey, we would really love your input, and give some context. We're asking for lots of input. You may or may not see your individual input represented, but that doesn't mean that we didn't hear it, that we don't appreciate it, that it didn't become part of our process. And sometimes I think that context, we're going too quickly and we don't take that extra step to explain. And so then people say, oh, well, they're always listening and never responding, right? And then it actually makes things worse, because then people have an expectation that something's going to be done with their input. And if it's not, then it can become a negative for sure.
Well, you mentioned something earlier about wanting to clarify during the process the desired outcomes and clarify that as much as possible up front. So here's one of the challenges. Sometimes people don't always know what they want from this process in one of two ways. One is they don't always have a clear definition of what is strategy, what's a strategic focus area, what's a direction, what's a goal, what's an objective. These terms are used interchangeably. There's all sorts of different ambiguity around it. And the other aspect is the content of these. Is it strategic enough? Is it goal-ish enough? Is it objective-ish enough? Okay, Nolan, in 30 seconds, what is strategy in your view? What is a good litmus test to help define what is strategy in essence in your view?
I think for a competitive business, strategy is outlining the prioritized set of choices that an organization will make and will focus on to win. In a more mission-centered organization where winning is not necessarily the objective, then I think in place of winning, it's your vision and your mission, your aspiration and your purpose for existing. And what are the choices that will help you best fulfill those two things?
Clear, all around choice. And it's focused around either the winning element or the mission or both. And then to build on that, how many strategies, how many focus areas, because that's often one of those questions around how many are we shooting for? 3, 5, 15, 38? And I'll just share a brief example. One past client of ours several years ago ended up with 38. I will admit we were not involved in that process. Later on, we became involved and found out they had 38 strategic objectives. I respect the process. My initial professional opinion was way too much. Then they created 38 task forces, and about month 3 or 4, they were so bogged down with task force meetings that the rest of the operation started to suffer. Talk to us in terms of how many meetings, no, rather, how many objectives, how many strategies is the right number then?
That's a great example, and I've seen that in other organizations as well, right? Where you suffer under the weight of what you've created because it's too complex.
Right.
So typically, and again, the nomenclature can change and be different, but if we said very generically an organization strategy was to win based on low cost, they're going to be lowest cost in their competitor set, then I would expect as part of that strategy that they would have no more than 3 to 5 key strategic pillars or strategic focus areas that defined broadly the choices they were going to make to be lowest cost. For me, 3 to 5 is a really good rule of thumb. Now, we could have endless intellectual debate about, well, what about 6? But the point is having few enough that it's memorable. If I can't remember the 3 strategic focus areas for my company, how am I ever going to be aligned or have my day-to-day decisions and choices and work align with those? And so now, once you have the 3 to 5 defined, sure, there's all kinds of levels of cascading, and you might have 3,800 objectives at different levels of the organization, but any individual may only have 3 to 5. And so there's that focus and there's that clarity for each individual in how they're contributing, how they are helping the company ultimately win or achieve their mission.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Nolan, especially for the strategic planning process, where do teams get stuck in this process?
Yeah, I think there's several places that tend to be kind of typical. The first place is one that we've already talked about, and it's the choice about whether to do it or not. So sometimes they get stuck and immobilized by saying, this is going to take too much time, too much effort. We have too many fires burning. There's too many urgent things happening. And so they don't do it at all. And they kick the can down the road. And what happens, of course, is they keep operating the exact same way they've been operating, and they're not making traction. They're not making progress. So that's one. A second one is, and I don't, generally I don't see this a lot, but it can happen, especially if you've got a larger executive team or team at any level that's doing this. There can be, if there are unclear decision rights, then you can get into some conflict that gets unresolved and that keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. And so that's a place where I see some teams getting stuck. Not too many, but some. Probably the biggest place that I see people get stuck, and we may not think of it as getting stuck necessarily, because stuck sounds like we don't know what to do. But the biggest place I see people getting stuck is leaving a wonderful strategy planning session or process and then not executing, and it not getting communicated in the right ways, not getting followed up in the right ways, not having the integrative or the management mechanisms in place to then, communicate, implement, manage it, track it, measure it, follow up, tweak it, all of those things afterwards. I love this quote, and we could replace plans with strategy, but this quote from Peter Drucker: plans are just good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. And that's the place I see strategy get stuck. And I've told, in fact, I've told some clients recently that, look, we can walk away from a strategy session and have an amazing conversation, a beautiful document, and if it doesn't get translated into how the organization's executing, then we just wasted our time. So anyway, those are a few of the spots where I see problems.
Yeah, this implementation, I want to put a pin in this implementation because I want to spend more time on that in a moment. There have been some great comments here. Let's go first. Mary has offered a thought around where some teams get stuck is just even being able to know how to place a bet on where they want to go in the future. And she might be talking about, it's somewhat easier, and I'll say easier in quotes, to assess where you're currently at or look historically. Easier simply because you have the data. Okay, good. It's harder to be able to then assess and place bets and to agree upon where the future might be because, well, you don't know. And you have to figure out then and say, yes, this is where we're going to go. And that's a challenging thing to be able to come to terms with. And sometimes the lack of decision results and it can perpetuate. And I don't know, Nolan, if you've been part of teams that just, you do some planning and then it just kind of ... never quite finishes.
Yeah, it's a great point. One tool, one approach to get after that is, as you're doing it, I mean, Mary put it out here, I think in a nice way. It's based on what you know today and based on what you are projecting about tomorrow. You could even come up with a system where you place probabilities. Now, this may not be highly scientific, but you go with what are the most likely scenarios, and and Daniel, I know we've done a fair amount of work in scenario-based strategy planning, right? To look at that.
Yeah.
And so you can create the framework in a way to help the team work through that and have structure help you make some decisions based on, again, what you know today and what you believe to be most likely about the future. And this, in one sense, I think this relates to this other question that someone asked about how often the plan should be revisited and adjusted.
Yeah.
So in larger organizations, a lot of times the board will direct and will mandate to some degree strategy planning periods. A lot of times those are 3 years or 5 years. In smaller organizations or in much faster paced industries or high growth, you may need to revisit it every quarter and just do a gut check and say, is there anything we need to tweak or adjust for our next quarter? As so the timeframes are a lot, are highly variable depending on some of those factors. And to Mary's point, if you're in a highly uncertain situation, you could have those checkpoints established more frequently to be able to, even if it was an hour, right? Even if you get people together for an hour and you say, hey, let's take a look at our strategy. What has changed about the external environment and what do we need to tweak, or what do we need to schedule more time to go deeper into?
And building on that, in your view, Nolan, is it the sort of thing to have an annual official formal checkpoint? Is it the sort of thing to have a quarterly? Or some organizations do a 3-year strategic plan and they don't look at it, or rather, they look at it, but they don't revisit it and redo it again for another 3 years. What's that sense of timing that maybe should be considered?
Yeah. I mean, because of the world and the market in which we're living, that seems so volatile and so ever changing. I don't think it's wise to be so locked in that you say we're not revisiting this for 3 years. What if significant sectors in your industry pivoted and shifted in a period of in those 3 years? You would be left in the dust. So I think you have to have an awareness of the market dynamics within your industry, and you have to keep a pulse on that and be willing to adjust and flex as needed. I do think starting with a cadence that works for your business today, whatever that is, again, quarterly, annually, every 3 years, I think that's fine. But I also think that whoever is responsible for strategy has to be constantly scanning the environment and making sure that the business is being proactive and is keeping up and ahead with trends and with external changes.
So let's go there here, because this helps manage. Kitty talked about kind of the other challenge, which is the reality check. Is it an aspirational, or is it how practical is it? And Erwin brings up this great point as you then start getting into implementation. So let's go there. We've talked a lot about the process of creating, but so much of it actually is in the implementation. What does good implementation look like so that the plans don't just sit on the proverbial shelf or are communicated and then they don't go anywhere? What really are what does good look like to then make sure it actually has legs?
Sure. So good looks like clarity and alignment at every level, plus let's call it plans and accountability. If there is a strategy, and it doesn't matter what level in the organization, but there's a strategy at some level, if that strategy does not get communicated and translated in a clear and coherent way to the rest of the organization that's responsible for executing it, I think that's problematic. And that's a big thing that keeps it from being implemented and executed and driving work at the end of the day. So that's that's a big one. Another typical way that organizations will use to implement strategy is through a goal planning, performance management, if you want to call it that kind of process, where every individual at their level either sets goals or has goals. Again, different organizations do that differently. But the idea with the goals is that those goals provide clarity, focus, and direction for each individual team member within their scope of responsibility. And the tighter the alignment of that cascading approach, that if our strategy is low cost, that someone at the front line that is working day to day with customers, for example, that they know what they're responsible to do day to day to help drive that low cost strategy. That's a really good litmus test to see how effective have we been at actually executing it and getting it implemented. So those are a few things. There are many others that we could talk about. Those are a few keys. Daniel, I would just throw one other thing out, and this is another tangent and probably another leadership growth hour kind of topic, but the strategic organization design choices that senior leaders would make to align the organization to that strategy also become really important because of how much they impact and affect how people work together and the culture of the organization. So,
oh, I love it. But let's touch upon what you just mentioned, because we have the strategy, you get goals, but there is something else, and that is to then make sure the structure and the systems and the processes and the skill capabilities are put into place. Because you can have the goals, you can communicate all you want, but if people continue to do the same processes and getting different results than the ones we're desiring, but they're getting the results from the processes that currently exist, those need to be relooked at. And that's hard work. That is the hard work that often is uncomfortable to then dive into.
Yeah, that's right. And it can get complex very quickly. But that's a great, I think, Daniel, that's a great point, that just like with strategy, we are prioritizing our choices as a business. As we clarify strategy, especially at the senior most level of the organization, it becomes important to prioritize which of those processes or structures or capabilities needs to be relooked at and may need to be adjusted or transformed to some degree, because it has such a broad impact on how the organization operates and its ability to execute its strategy. One of the great examples from kind of business history is Southwest Airlines. And I won't go into all the details. What I love about Southwest is it's an accessible company. We know a lot about it, right? It's a public company and they've been around for a long time, and their business model has been studied. And so many of the choices they made in how they set up their business model and their operating model were aligned to their strategy of being low cost, of being fun loving, right? Of creating an amazing customer and employee experience. And so there are lots of other examples like that, but that's the importance of it. And it is hard work because it's transformative usually, and you need to be committed to it in the long term as well.
And what you're pointing out is making sure it's aligned and avoiding distraction. And this distraction, it's always amazing. a distraction can be mislabeled, and it's really important during the strategic planning process to then be able to label the distraction as a distraction, because you may be in a business, you may be doing a certain process, you may be focusing on a new product, and in fact, after the strategic planning process, that is then a distraction because it's no longer aligned. It might be good, it might be lovely, it might be something you like. However, it is actually now a distraction, and we need to pause it or move it out or divest it. And these are the very challenging choices which can then be informed based upon the strategy itself.
Correct. I agree. I had this conversation with the head of a function recently, and they were expressing some concern about, their function potentially not being as valued in the business. And on the one hand, I expressed some concern and some sympathy and some empathy about, that's really challenging. On the flip side, from a business standpoint, that may be a really clear strategic choice, and it may actually help focus resources even more. It won't feel good to the people in that function because they want to be more valued. And yet the choices that business is making, when you make choices, you have to say yes to some things and no to many. And it becomes really challenging. And I see this as an even bigger problem. The more technical, the higher skill the workforce, the more challenging it becomes because people are working on projects that excite them, that capitalize on their strengths and their skills and their experiences. And sometimes when those go away strategically, those individuals are very reticent to let go.
Yeah. Nolan, oftentimes during the strategic planning process, as well as during the implementation, organizations will choose to have a point person, either internal or external or a combination of both. How and when should an organization decide when to have an internal or an external person guide and direct, facilitate some of this planning process? What's the criteria they should use to make that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think some basics about the internal versus external, and if you're going to go internal, who you select. It's got to be someone that is able to be objective and impartial, right? And is aligned with whatever leader or set of leaders ultimately owns the strategy and is responsible for that. And there's got to be it's got to be someone with a strong facilitation skill set and background, as well as strategy skill set and background. And those can vary, again, depending on the complexity of the situation. And so those become critical. And what I see a lot of times, for instance, when we get brought into organizations to do this, it's not always even that they don't have people that are capable. Many have very senior and seasoned people. It's that it becomes really challenging to be objective when you have skin in the game about the strategic choices being made, and you are asked then to facilitate a process or a set of meetings. And it's human nature that you're going to tend to skew to your own agenda, the things that are in your own head, without any bad intent, right? That's just the nature of it. And the other aspect I would just highlight again, Daniel, that we brought up is the other elements that come into play where there are team dynamics happening that an external consultant and facilitator can really help with. Sometimes we even do work with clients where we are coaching some of the executives that are on that team, for example, individually. And so there can be residual benefits that way to be able to observe them in action and give feedback. And so there are a lot of different benefits. Again, there's not a right or wrong. But I do think it comes down to, are they able to be objective, and do they have the skill set required to really run, a rigorous and a structured process that will produce the right outcomes.
Yeah, that's well said.
And I've seen it. I've seen the point person, again, even when we are brought in, I've seen the point person vary. CEO, chief strategy officer, head of HR, there's a whole host of roles that I've seen kind of play this function. So
yeah. Okay, Nolan, last question, then we're going to wrap up.
okay.
What is the one thing, Nolan, that you want people to leave with to help them, enable them to make strategic planning work across the organization? What's the one thing?
Do it. Begin where you are, do it, and follow it through, right, to the point where it devolves into hard work. And even if it's super simple, even if you do it in a very small department or function within the organization, do it, learn from it, and then get better at it. Because as a capability, it's imperative for a business to grow and thrive, to be able to strategically plan, and to do it well, and to have it devolve into hard work.
Well said. Nolan, thank you for being on the Leadership Growth Hour today.
Thank you. It's been a great discussion, Daniel. I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody's engagement, comments, and questions as well.
To register for future Leadership Growth Hour events, please visit stewartleadership.com/events. We'd love to have you join us. Till next time, take care, everyone.